Hello everyone, my name is Rolake Akinkugbe-Filani, and I guess you can call me an energy and infrastructure guru. My 9 to 5 is in infrastructure development across Africa, while my other preoccupations mostly have to do with being a subject matter expert on the global energy landscape, coaching executives in public speaking, and working to improve the lives, careers, and business prospects of African women everywhere. So on to one of my favorite topics, energy. This video is the first of a 3-part series I'll be doing on Africa and the global energy transition. This first video will lay out the opportunities I see for disruption in African energy. Then, in part 2, I'll talk about how the continent can harness local value chains and create a jobs boom from the energy transition to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And finally, in part 3, I will propose some high-level economic and policy strategies that I hope will provide ample fodder in policymakers' decisions about sector development and the energy landscape across Africa. So, is Africa ripe for another energy sector revolution? Well, my view is that hydrocarbons cannot exclusively meet rising demand on the continent. For me, the biggest game changers will be in power generation with the growth of renewables and natural gas, and perhaps electric vehicles in transportation. But it's all about the infrastructure. I'm sure you're wondering, for a continent that has not fully conquered how to meet fossil fuel demand efficiently in the form of petrol and diesel for local transportation and to meet domestic electric needs, this may sound idealistic, but markets evolve despite inefficiencies. If you look at renewables, they already account for around 20% of Africa's installed generation capacity. That's according to international oil company BP. And according to the International Energy Agency, scaling up Africa's capacity to achieve universal access to energy by 2030 will require $100 billion a year, of which 40% will be dedicated to solar, wind, and other low-carbon power generation projects. Africa actually has the potential to install 300 gigawatts of clean power, or half the continent's total capacity, to meet nearly a quarter of the energy needs by 2030. But North Africa is actually leading the way. And the big projects in 2021 are expected to be in countries like Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. Beyond that, nearly 40 out of 54 African countries have installed or plan to install solar power projects. And in fact, the cost for solar photovoltaic, solar PV, fell 82% between 2010 and 2019. So it's pretty clear that Africa could be fertile ground for solar, but this disruption, you'll be surprised to know, is not likely to come from utility scale projects. In fact, utility scale solar markets in Africa have struggled. We've seen administrative delays, some unbankable power purchasing agreements, difficulties securing land, and all of this is holding back project development. The main revolution, I think, will come from the off-grid distributed renewable energy space, with a focus on the commercial and industrial market segment. There is an estimated 74 megawatts of installed capacity recorded, so it is still small. The commercial and industrial solar sector in Africa is growing, not because of regulatory support, but because of economics. So net metering schemes, which have been proposed around the region, are rarely available. Instead, installations are designed so that electricity generated can be consumed directly by the host facility. So this revolution is actually meaning that entire off-grid, captive, and mini-grid ecosystems are bypassing large-scale national grid systems and going directly to consumers. And in fact, the largest consumer is the manufacturing sector. And easy-to-deploy off-grid solar technology has risen significantly in terms of demand, particularly for sectors like education and healthcare. So what about electric vehicles? Let's talk about EVs next. I hear you smirk. EVs in Africa? Well, I'm not talking about a new dawn of high-powered Tesla vehicles zooming across the streets of Joburg or Lagos. No, I'm talking about the global EV and battery storage market. More than 5 million electric vehicles were sold globally last year. And although Africa is still only a fraction of this market, the continent can take advantage of a silent revolution in the global battery market. So with urbanization rates of 4% annually and a corresponding increase in the vehicle fleet, a gradual shift to low emissions transport systems should be seen by Africa's policymakers as inevitable. Electric vehicles will eventually become cheaper as battery prices continue to fall, whilst tightening emissions regulations are helping to reshape emerging transportation technology and, of course, improve air quality. But I think this new revolution is actually very, very huge in terms of value creation. And let me tell you why. So take the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, for instance. The DRC is rich in battery minerals like copper and cobalt. And in fact, it produces 13% of global copper and around 70% of the world's cobalt. That's about 100,000 tons in 2020. But it has only managed to capture 3% of the global battery value chain. Now, that global value chain is estimated to reach 300 billion by 2030. But I won't get into that now, as part 2 of this series delves deeper into this subject. So just imagine if Africa didn't only produce cobalt, but if it did the smelting, the refining, if it produced battery cells, if it did the cell assembling, which, by the way, is a 1.1 trillion market. I could go on and on. The significant disruption to the energy industry and the spurring of growth and the new jobs market would be significant. But I'll get to that in part 2 of the video. So if we look at disruptive technologies, the signs are always there. We see changing consumer preferences. We see oligopolistic industries, which stifle innovation to preserve the status quo and are thus blindsided by new entrants. We also see efficient and cheaper alternatives, or negative consumer sentiment and rising consumer awareness. And I think the confluence of these factors could reorder Africa's incumbent energy systems with gas, renewables, and transportation at its heart. If you also add up all the deficits of Africa's utilities, estimated at 21 billion annually, those are the deficits, you quickly realize the enormous amount of waste involved in maintaining a grid-based and a fossil fuel system that has not always served all. So my clarion call here is not for a zero-sum approach. We all know that multiple fuel sources can coexist in Africa. After all, the technologies that utilize alternative and cleaner fuel sources have not evolved rapidly across all African countries, while the infrastructure to support these is only slowly developing. So if we take transition fuels such as compressed natural gas, CNG, it's a gas transport technology that has been around for decades and should be a natural substitute means of use for many of Africa's rural and semi-urban communities who are unlikely to ever consume piped gas due to the huge capital cost of piping to remote areas for domestic use. But challenges with bulk transportation of CNG via trucking have constrained consumption via this method too, known as virtual pipelines. There are some welcome signs of increased uptake of CNG in transportation. So for instance, last year, Egypt signed an agreement to convert thousands of diesel-powered cars to CNG fuel as part of a government policy initiative to improve gas consumption locally and incentivize consumption of low-carbon fuels. In December 2020 as well, the Nigerian government announced that it would kickstart the distribution of compressed natural gas as a key transport fuel by the end of 2021 as part of its strategy to gradually replace high sulfur gasoline under its Natural Gas Expansion Program, NGEP. It also hopes to get up to 1 million vehicles converted from gasoline to CNG by the end of 2021. Now, given that auto gas and CNG are generally price competitive versus gasoline, this could be a game changer for countries like Nigeria. Africa today has roughly 300,000 natural gas vehicles in operation, with only about 250 stations servicing these. I mean, that's hardly a revolution, given the fact that the continent's vehicle fleet is about 50 million strong. However, we do know that market inefficiencies and infrastructure challenges create the very foundation for leapfrogging and disruptive trends that are likely to make other energy sources viable. EVs, for instance, could well become more popular than, or even leapfrog NGVs in some African countries, given the challenges of CNG, for instance. So whilst preferences amongst Africa's energy consumers have not radically changed, since most of us still use equipment, generators, machines, and vehicles that require fossil fuel energy sources to work, energy consumers on the continent are increasingly cost sensitive and in many instances becoming much more environmentally and ecologically sensitive. So technological innovation and sheer necessity will ultimately force a shift in African consumer preferences and choices, as we've seen with the rise of off-grid technology. In just a few years, for instance, the market on the continent for basic pay-as-you-go solar-powered lights and home systems, phone charging, and basic appliances has grown rapidly, with more than 15 million units sold. So imagine the implied revolution in making decentralized customers on the continent make small payments for bits of equipment and appliances over a period. These consumers' preferences also point to cost as a future deterrent to specific modes of energy consumption in transportation. In Kenya, for instance, recent research showed that commuters spend up to 30% of their monthly incomes on transportation due to high fuel costs. Moreover, the cost and fiscal burden of Africa's fuel-based economies are a problem. Today, the cost of fuel subsidies across the continent averages out at around 1.5% of GDP. Now, that is not a sustainable way to develop an economy. And with the rising rates of urbanization and the push for low emissions transportation systems, I think this shift should be seen by African policymakers and the private sector as inevitable. EVs themselves will eventually become cheaper as battery prices continue to fall, whilst emissions regulation will continue to shape transportation technology and improve air quality. Renewables such as solar photovoltaic, solar PV are being predicted to surpass coal as the largest source of power generation in Africa by 2030. And this is underpinned by the fact that the cost of solar panels have fallen by more than 50% in the past decade. Even the appliance systems that we have got so used to, such as the LED light bulb, the simplest of which has fallen in cost by almost 85% and lasts 30 times longer than its incandescent counterpart, has continued to fall. The costs have continued to fall. I hear you say, well, Rolake, there are limits to Africa's ability to leapfrog in the energy space. Well, yes and no. There are, of course, limitations in the pace of disruption in African energy. So I'll give you an example. If we look at the case of renewables in power generation, at least 40% of the African communities that utilize solar energy still rely on baseload fossil fuel energy sources as a backup, giving the obvious intermittency of solar. In addition, new hydrocarbons discoveries on the continent mean governments can't abandon incumbent energy sources altogether. Today, proven oil and gas reserves exceed 150 billion barrels of oil equivalent. A short-term priority, in my view, should be how to harness these resources in a sustainable way and use the proceeds of their production to build inclusive and sustainable African economies that thrive on a balanced and cleaner energy mix. So I hope you learned something and found this video interesting. If so, please do follow on my YouTube channel at Rolake Akinkugbe and other platforms. You can like, share, comment, and of course, subscribe. In my next video, I talk about creating a jobs boom through value creation with a focus on the global battery value chain and the energy transition, as well as the types of local content policies that can spur sustainable economic growth across the continent. Thanks for listening and see you next time.